Hi, it's Pastor Andy again. This week's videos are indirectly a continuing look at Romans 3, verses 21 through 26. I preached on that passage, again, what many people call the greatest paragraph ever written. I preached on that on August 23rd, and then the Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday of that week, the 24th, 25th, 26th, I gave a verse by verse account of 21, 22, 23. Then last week, I gave a verse by verse closer look on 24, 25, 26. So this week, if you watched the video yesterday, you saw how I tied in the book of Esther and Hebrews into this. Today, I'm going to look at the Old Testament, Joseph, the life of Joseph from the Old Testament. And one little caveat that might surprise you from history and how all this unpacks. So, when we look at Genesis chapter the end of Genesis, beginning in chapter 37, we see the life of Joseph, the son of whom we call Israel, and Joseph got into a little bit of trouble with his family, his father included, but certainly his brothers, because God gave him these dreams about how great he would become someday, and when he was sharing the the truth of these dreams, what he had dreamed, well, they didn't like it so well. So what the brothers did is, while they were out away from their father one day, they sold their brother Joseph to a group of travelers, the Ishmaelites. They sold him for 20 pieces of silver to this passing group of people. Now, that group of people would then head on to Egypt, and they would sell Joseph on to Egypt. And he ended up in Potiphar's house, but eventually we know that Joseph became a great leader. In fact, he was second in all the nation to Pharaoh after a period of time. That happened, and he helped save them and brought the Israelites to Egypt. Well, during my sermon on the 23rd, and then later that week, Rick, in his message, I think it was Thursday the 27th, talked about Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi he had this code that he developed approximately 300 years, maybe 350 even or so, before the time of Moses. And that time frame is important. Now, there's a couple of pictures that Susan's going to pop up here for you that you can look at. And one of the pictures, if you see, neither one of these pictures are too clear. We have to realize these are nearly 4,000 years old right now. So one of the pictures has an image of two people on it. And what that picture is that Hammurabi is receiving the code from his god. Now, he was a king. He did not worship Yahweh. He did not know Yahweh. His God was most likely the Babylonian king, Marduk. So we have him standing before the king receiving this code. That was one of the images. The other image that you can see, or that you may have seen a moment ago, is the text of this code. And again, there were many, many laws. A lot of it was commercially related. How do you deal with this transaction, this transaction? Well, one of the things about that transaction, about that list of codes, is the amount for which a slave should be sold. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Before I do, let me say this, that Yahweh giving the law to Moses is similar to the way it is depicted that Marduk gave or whoever the god was, gave the law to Hammurabi. But we see that Joseph was in Egypt probably as a relatively young man, because he was sold by his brothers. Genesis 50 tells us that he died at 110. We know that there was several generations that passed because the Pharaoh that came along forgot about Moses. In fact, the Bible tells us that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. Now, some of that would have included Joseph's time. We also know that Moses was 80 years old when he led them out. So again, there's some overlap in some of that time frame, but there was 430 years. Well, That's a little bit longer than the time from Hammurabi to the time that the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments and the law was given to Moses. But the timing here is pretty consistent because, again, we don't know exactly when Hammurabi would have received that code. But if we think about the fact that maybe about 430 years prior, at least 300 and some odd years prior, give or take Joseph's age as well, when the Ishmaelites bought Joseph from his brothers, they paid 20 shekels of silver, paid 20 coins. Well, Hammurabi's code says that a slave should be sold for 20 pieces of silver. Now, don't get this confused with Jesus. Jesus was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, and Jesus wasn't a slave, and that was an entirely different situation. But here we have the code of Hammurabi showing up in the Bible without being named, with this amount of the transaction being 20 pieces of silver. What this shows us is that the Bible represents the reality of what was going on in history, and history represents the reality of what is recorded in the Bible. Now, there's a lot of things in the Bible that we don't really know. In fact, I was just sharing with one of our church members the other day. We did not know that David truly existed. I mean, if you believe the Bible, yes, David is there, but history had no record of David until the 1990s when there was a stele uncovered that talked about the house of David in a place called Dan in Israel. So how does this relate to Romans? Well, in Romans 3:24, it talks about the fact that God has redeemed us. And as I mentioned in my sermon that day, on August 23rd, that redemption had a very specific meaning in the first century. And that redemption was the idea that God has freed us from slavery. That redemption was somebody paying the fee for a slave to be free, and God has paid for our freedom. It meant to purchase the freedom of a slave. And you and I are slaves, or at least we were. We are slaves to sin. We needed to be purchased, but the price that God had to pay was not 20 shekels of silver, or 20 pieces of silver of any kind, which, by the way, that weight is about $200 in today's terms. That was nothing, $200 for a slave way back then. But what we know is that it cost Jesus everything. Jesus was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, but it cost him his blood. It cost him his life for us to be truly redeemed. So let us not take our freedom lightly. Joseph was sold as a slave, but he became a great leader in Egypt. He was the second in command, as I said earlier. Now, I don't know what life holds in store for you or for me, but I do know that God has a higher purpose for all of us than we can possibly imagine for ourselves. And as Jesus has already paid the price for our freedom, as Jesus has already made that purpose possible for us, what we need to do is show our thanks to God for the price that he was willing to pay. Will you do that for God today?